Light travels at about 300,000 kilometers per second. Everyone knows that. It leaves the sun, crosses empty space, and reaches your eyes 8 minutes later. That is usually where the explanation stops. But when I hear that light travels through space, I immediately want to ask what that sentence is actually saying. What does travel mean here? What is moving? Through what, exactly? And why should this be the correct way to think about it just because we have repeated the sentence often enough? Naming a speed is not an explanation. Quoting a rule is not an explanation. Even attaching a famous name to the rule does not explain anything. It only creates the feeling that the question has already been settled. Most people never feel the need to go further because the picture feels complete. Something leaves one place, moves through space, and arrives somewhere else. That is how objects behave. Stones behave that way. Bullets behave that way. So light must behave that way too. That belief feels finished. But nothing has actually been explained yet. If light is something that travels, then it must be something in motion. And motion, as we understand it from everything else in daily life, always means motion relative to something. A thing moves through air, through water, through space. Motion is defined against a background. So the question I want to ask is not how fast light goes. The question is what it means for light to go anywhere at all. This is usually where people point to waves. Light is a wave, they say. Waves travel. Sound travels. Water waves travel. Problem solved. For a moment that feels satisfying. Sound needs air. Water waves need water. A wave is something that happens to a medium. The medium stays where it is. The disturbance moves. For a brief moment, intuition relaxes. Then the problem appears. If light is a wave, what is waving? Not metaphorically, physically. What is the thing that oscillates when light passes through empty space? For a long time, physics assumed there must be an answer. An invisible substance, a universal medium filling all of space, something that light ripples through the way sound ripples through air. The assumption was not foolish. It was unavoidable, given how waves behaved everywhere else. But when people went looking for this medium, it refused to show itself. Experiments became more careful. Measurements became more precise. The Earth moved through space. Seasons changed. Directions changed. Yet the behavior of light did not shift the way it should have if it were moving through a substance. This is where intuition begins to strain, but not break yet. One can always imagine the medium is just very strange, very subtle, difficult to detect. Then a deeper problem emerges. Light does not just behave oddly with respect to motion, it behaves oddly with respect to time. No matter how fast the observer moves, the measured speed of light remains the same. That sentence sounds familiar. It is taught early. It is often treated as the explanation itself. But it explains nothing. If I move toward a sound source, I encounter the sound waves more quickly. If I move away more slowly, that is what motion through a medium looks like. The fact that light refuses to do this is not a detail. It is a structural warning. At this point, physics faced a choice. Either invent increasingly elaborate excuses for why light behaves unlike every other wave we know, or abandon the assumption that it is traveling through something at all. This is where intuition begins to crack. Instead of asking how light moves through space, one can ask a different question. What if light is not something moving in space, but something happening to space? That question sounds vague at first. It sounds like wordplay. But it forces a reorganization of everything that comes next. Electric and magnetic fields were already known to exist. They were not substances. They did not flow like fluids. They described how forces behave at every point in space and time, and they could change. When those changes were examined carefully, something unexpected appeared. A change in an electric field necessarily produces a change in a magnetic field. A change in a magnetic field necessarily produces a change in an electric field. Each creates the other. Once that structure exists, something remarkable follows. A self-sustaining pattern of change becomes possible. Not a thing moving through space, but a pattern unfolding across it. At this point, the idea of travel begins to mislead. Nothing is being carried along. No substance is flowing. The field at one location changes, and that change constrains how the field at a neighboring location must change next. The speed of light is not the speed of an object. It is the speed at which this pattern of change is allowed to propagate by the structure of the laws themselves. This is why the speed is the same for everyone. It is not a velocity relative to a background. It is a conversion factor between space and time built into reality. Asking to outrun it is like asking to step outside geometry. Now, the earlier failures make sense, but only in retrospect. There was no medium to detect because there was no medium. There was no variation with motion because nothing was moving through anything. The pattern does not ride on space. It is defined by space. This is the point where common sense usually objects. Everything we experience involves objects moving. Of course, intuition resists. It was trained on chairs and stones and air currents. It was never trained on fields. But the experiments do not care about comfort. They only care about consistency. Every test confirms the same structure. Light bends near massive objects, not because it is deflected like a projectile, but because the geometry it unfolds within is altered. Light interferes with itself not because pieces collide, but because patterns overlap. What we casually call a photon is not a tiny bead racing through emptiness. It is the smallest unit by which these changes can occur. A bookkeeping rule, not a miniature object with a path. So when I say light does not travel through space, I am not denying measurement. I am denying a picture. The picture of something moving from here to there through an empty container is the mistake. Light does not move within space the way a thing moves within a room. Light is a way space itself is allowed to change. Once this is seen, the discomfort is unavoidable. If one of our most familiar explanations collapses under inspection, how many others survive only because we stopped asking at the wrong moment? The danger is not that reality is strange. The danger is that explanations can feel complete long before they explain anything at all. Light was never a traveler. It was a rule. And rules do not go anywhere. They simply hold. Time flows forward. Everyone knows that. Clocks tick. Calendars advance. Causes come before effects. That belief feels so obvious that questioning it sounds unnecessary. But when I say time flows, I have to ask what that sentence is actually claiming. What is moving? Past what? At what rate? And measured against what background? Because motion without a reference is not motion at all. We point to clocks as evidence. The hands move, the digits change, the atoms oscillate. And because something changes, we say time is flowing. But that only names a correlation. It does not explain the mechanism. A clock does not detect time. A clock is a physical process, and physical processes change, even if time is never mentioned. If all clocks were destroyed, nothing about reality would slow down. Stars would still burn, particles would still decay, fields would still evolve. The universe would not pause, waiting for a wristwatch. So the question is not whether change exists. The question is why we interpret change as evidence of something flowing behind it. For a moment, intuition pushes back. We remember waiting. We remember boredom. We remember anticipation. Time feels real because experience feels stretched. That sensation seems decisive. Then physics interrupts. When motion is examined closely, time does not behave like a river. Different observers measure different durations for the same event, not because of faulty clocks, but because time itself does not assign a single duration to anything. This is not a philosophical detail. It is measurable. Two identical clocks separated and reunited will disagree. Neither is wrong. There is no hidden true time correcting them. At this point, one can still try to save the flow idea. Perhaps time flows differently for different observers. Perhaps it bends or stretches. But flow implies a background. A river flows through something. If time flows, what does it flow through? This is where intuition begins to fail silently. In the structure of physics, time is not something events happen in. Time is one of the coordinates used to describe how events relate. Change does not occur because time moves. Time is inferred because change has a structure. When equations describe motion, they do not contain a ticking entity pushing reality forward. They describe relations between states. Given one state, another follows not because time pushes it, but because the laws connect them. Nothing waits for time to advance. The universe does not check a clock before continuing. The sensation of flow comes from memory. Records accumulate, traces persist. The past leaves marks, the future does not. That asymmetry creates direction without motion. This is where intuition breaks again. We want time to be an active agent, but physics keeps removing agents. First light stopped being a traveler. Now time stops being a current. What we call now is not a moving point. It is a label attached to a physical configuration that contains memories of other configurations. The unsettling implication is this: change does not require time to flow, it only requires structure. Time, like light, was never doing what the language suggested. It was not moving us forward. We were mistaking correlation for cause. And if something as central as time can feel so obvious while being so misunderstood, it becomes difficult to trust any explanation that feels complete simply because it feels familiar. Space is empty. Everyone knows that. Between stars there is nothing. Between atoms, even less. That belief feels so settled that it rarely invites inspection. But when I say space is empty, I have to ask what that sentence actually commits me to. Empty of what? Empty in what sense? And why should nothing still have measurable properties? Because emptiness, if it is truly nothing, should do nothing. At first, the picture feels clear. Space is a container. Objects sit inside it. Remove the objects and the container remains. Quiet, passive, uninvolved. That picture feels finished. But nothing has actually been explained yet. If space is merely a stage, then it should not influence the actors. Distances should be neutral. Directions should be arbitrary. Motion should be simple translation through an indifferent backdrop. For a moment, this seems to work. On human scales, space appears uniform. You walk forward, you turn around, nothing resists you, nothing reacts. Then gravity intrudes. Objects do not simply move through space. They accelerate toward each other, and not because of a rope or a push or a medium dragging them along. They accelerate even when nothing is present between them. So one might say gravity acts across empty space. That explanation sounds familiar. It also explains nothing. How does empty space transmit an influence without containing anything that transmits it? How does nothing pull? For a while, physics tolerated this discomfort. The mathematics worked. Predictions matched observation. The unease was postponed. Then a deeper problem appeared. Gravity does not behave like a force traveling through space at all. It behaves like something already built into the geometry of where things are allowed to go. At this point, intuition tries to adapt. Perhaps space has properties. Perhaps it is not truly empty. Perhaps it is filled with something too subtle to see. That move feels reasonable. It preserves the container picture while adding texture. But the evidence refuses to cooperate. Clocks tick at different rates depending on where they are placed, not because of motion, not because of mechanisms inside them, but because of their position. If space were merely a backdrop, location would not affect time. Yet it does. So the question sharpens. If space can slow clocks, guide motion, and determine paths, in what sense is it empty? This is where the container picture collapses. Space is not a thing that exists first, waiting to be filled. It is a set of relationships, distances, durations, angles, and causal orderings. Remove matter, and those relationships do not vanish. They still have structure. Even in regions devoid of particles, fields fluctuate, not as particles popping in and out like objects, but as allowed variations constrained by deeper rules. The emptiness has behavior. This is where language begins to betray us. We say nothing is there, but we still measure energy. We still observe effects. We still detect limits. Empty space resists compression. It sets maximum speeds. It determines what can influence what and when. That is not nothing. The mistake was the same one made with light and time. We treated space as a passive arena because that picture was inherited from experience with rooms and containers. But the universe does not share our intuitions. Space does not sit beneath reality. It participates in it. Once that is seen, a pattern emerges. Light was not a thing moving through space. Time was not a current flowing beneath change. Space is not a box holding objects. Each time, intuition assumed a background. Each time, physics removed it. What remains is structure without substance, relations without carriers, rules without agents. And if space itself is not the empty stage we imagined, then the question is no longer what exists in the universe. The question becomes whether the universe was ever made of things the way we thought at all. Particles are things, everyone knows that. Little objects, tiny dots, smaller versions of what we handle every day. That belief feels unavoidable because the word itself already carries the picture. A particle is something you could point to if only your eyes were sharp enough. So when I say matter is made of particles, it sounds like an explanation. It feels finished, but once again, nothing has actually been explained. If particles are things, then they should have definite positions. They should be somewhere. If they move, they should move along paths. If they interact, they should do so by contact or exchange, the way objects always have. For a moment, this works. Cloud chambers leave tracks. Detectors click. Screens light up at specific locations. The evidence seems to confirm the picture. Then the cracks appear. When particles are examined carefully, they refuse to behave like objects. They do not have positions until something forces them to have one. They do not follow paths unless a measurement demands a path-like record. Left alone, they spread, not metaphorically, mathematically. Their influence distributes itself across space as if location were undecided. At this point, one might try to say the particle really is somewhere. We just do not know where. Ignorance feels safer than indeterminacy. But that move fails experimentally. The outcomes are not merely unknown beforehand. They are fundamentally unassigned. The theory does not contain hidden locations waiting to be revealed. It contains probabilities that only become facts when constrained. This is where intuition protests. Surely something must be there. Surely reality cannot be that vague. But the experiments do not allow compromise. Interference patterns appear even when particles are sent one at a time. Remove the possibility of knowing which path was taken, and the pattern returns. Restore the possibility, and it vanishes. Nothing else in experience behaves this way. At this point, one might retreat and say the mathematics works, but the picture is still particles. The strangeness is just how they move. That sounds reasonable. It is also false. What the mathematics actually describes is not a particle with changing properties. It describes a state, a structured set of possibilities. And that state evolves smoothly until an interaction forces a definite outcome. The particle is not what exists continuously, it is what appears discontinuously. This is the moment where language does real damage. We speak as if particles are the basic ingredients of reality, when in fact they are the events where underlying structure produces localized effects. A detector does not catch a thing that was traveling toward it. It participates in an interaction that produces a discrete record. The click is not the arrival of a bead, it is the creation of a fact. Once this is seen, earlier puzzles align. Light did not need to be a traveling object. Space did not need to be a container. Time did not need to flow, and particles do not need to exist as miniature solids. What exists are states and constraints, relations and allowed transformations. The sense of solidity comes from repetition. Stable patterns reinforce themselves. They persist. They interact reliably. We give those patterns names and imagine them as things. But stability is not substance. The unsettling implication is not that matter is unreal. It is that our notion of thing was borrowed from experience and projected too far downward. Reality does not appear to be built from objects that exist first and then interact. It appears to be built from interactions that occasionally produce objects. And if particles themselves are not the fundamental furniture of the universe, then the question shifts again. We are no longer asking what the world is made of. We are asking why anything ever looks like it is made of things at all.